Today's daf is daf Samach Aleph, and we begin with the Mishnah. We've already discussed in the previous Mishnah those karbonos, those menachos that need hagasha, and now we're going to talk about those menachos that need tnufa. Elu teunos tnufa v'ein teunos hagasha. So first we start with the category of those that require tnufa, the waving, but not hagasha. And we have on that list log shemen shel mitzor v'yashoma. So the mitzora, when he finishes his tzoras, he's got to bring a carbon asham together with a log shemen, and the combination thereof of the log shemen together with the asham mitzora requires tnufa. And we're going to have to study whether or not that tnufa is michayim or liachashchita. Right now, we're going to assume, until we know otherwise, that it's michayim. That's before you shecht the asham, and you do a tnufa. Now, the Mishnah wants to know whether or not bikurim requires tnufa. The basic halacha bikurim is requirement of hanocha, and you place the bikurim on the mizbeach. Not everybody agrees with that, but let's say we assume that that's the case, a sugya makis. And now Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is of the opinion that bikurim require not only hanocha, but also tnufa. Now, truth be told, the Mefarshim point out that it's not just Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov who holds like that. It's also the Shita of Yehuda. And the reason why the Mishnah specifically mentions Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is because we have a principle that the Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is kav and naki. We always paskin like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. He's not that frequently quoted, but whenever he is quoted, his opinion is accepted la halacha. And bikurim require tnufa in addition to hanocha. Ve'imurei shalmei yachid. Now, when the carbon shlomim is brought, then it requires that the emurim, after the zrikas adam, are burnt on the mizbeach. And another aspect of the shalmei yachid is tnufa. Now, in addition to the tnufa in shlomim of the emurim, there's also an additional requirement of tnufa, v'chaz v'shok shalahem. Now, the chaz v'shok are those parts of the carbon shlomim that cannot be eaten by a non-Kohen. They have to be given to the Kohen. And because the chaz v'shok is separate from the rest of the animal insofar as it belongs to the Kohanim, therefore it has its own halacha of tnufa. Now that tnufa has to be implemented by both the Bala Karban and the Kohanim and the Kohen. So we'll have to discuss later on Daf Samach Amud Beis how exactly the combined effort of both the Kohen and the Bailim in the act of tnufa is going to be accomplished. Now, this is all based on a pasuk. In the parsha of Shlomim, it says, in Vayikra Perek Yud, Shok hatruma v'chazei tnufa al ishei hachalovim yaviu lahanif tnufa lifnei Hashem. So the word tnufa here is explicit in the Torah as far as Shlom is concerned. Now, there's a very, shall I say, an aspect of this Mishnah that's dealt with at great length by the commentaries, and that is, why does the Mishnah isolate Shalmei Yachid? We have what's called Shalmei Tzibur. Shalmei Tzibur are the two kvasim that are brought with the Shtei Lechem on Chag HaShavuos, and they also require Tnufa. So some want to say that the reason why the Mishnah isolates or limits its words to Shalmi Yachid when the halacha applies even to Shalmi Tzibur is because in the case of Shalmi Yachid, the Tnufa is explicit in the Torah. However, the Sfas Emes has another pshat, and he says that in the case of a Shalmi Yachid, the Tnufa is done after Shechita, because you don't have a Murim, you don't have Chaz V'Shok until after the Shechita. L'umatzot, in contrast, we have in the case of Shalmi Tzibur, we have a Tnufa Michayim. While the animals are still alive before the Shechita, we will do Tnufa, as we'll soon see, and therefore the Mishnah here that's discussing a Murim and Chaz V'Shok will focus on Shalmi Yachid, because in Shalmi Yachid, it's only after the Shechita that there's Tnufa. Now we continue in the Mishnah. Echad Anoshim V'Echad Noshim. The requirement of Tnufa applies both to a carbon shlomim that's brought by a man, as well as a carbon shlomim that's brought by a woman. But we will see later on that even though the carbon of the Isha requires Tnufa, but she herself is not going to actually implement the Tnufa, but rather the Kohen is, so to speak, to her representative to implement the Tnufa. And then it says, B'Yisrael v'lo b'achirim. Achirim is a reference to the Goyim. And the impression you get from the Mishnah is that there's a contrast between a carbon of an Isha and a carbon of a Goy. And according to some Rishonim, which is the sheet of Tosfos, it means that in the case of a carbon shlomim of a Goy, there is no Tnufa at all. And that's what it means v'lo b'achirim, whereas in the case of a carbon of an Isha, even though she doesn't implement the Tnufa, but nevertheless the Kohen will implement the Tnufa on her behalf. Now we have a problem as to how to implement the Tnufa. Ketzad hu osa. Now, the Mishnah is focused on the Tnufa of Shalmei Tzibur, which means that the Torah requires in Shalmei Tzibur on Chag HaShavuos a Tnufa of both the Shtei Lechem and the Shnei Kvasim. How is that implemented? Nosein Shtei Lechem al Gabi Shnei Kvasim. So we're talking now before Shechita, and the two Kvasim have not been shechted yet, they're alive, and he places the Shtei Lechem on top of the Shnei Kvasim, and to the best of my knowledge, that's to be taken literally. Umeniach Shtei Yodov Lemata. So if I'm not mistaken, in Tnufa you need two Yadayim. Later on we'll talk about Smicha also requires two Yadayim, which makes the Avoda of Tnufa and Smicha very unique, because in all avodas of Karbanos we require Yamin, Dafka the right hand, but here we're requiring both hands. Now, it seems from the language of the Mishnah, Meniach Shtei Yodov Lemata, that the Tnufa should be done on the bottom, meaning you have the Shtei Lechem on top of the Shnei Kvasim, and then you lift, by putting your hands underneath the Shnei Kvasim, you lift both the Shnei Kvasim and the Shtei Lechem. And now the Mishnah is going to explain how you do the Tnufa in which directions. But just before we get to that, I thought I would point out that Bikurim, as we said before, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, require Tnufa. And the question is, if the Tnufa of Bikurim require both the Kohen and the Israel to do the Tnufa, in the case that we're dealing with now of the Shalmei Tzibur, the Kivsei says there's no specific Bailim, right? It's a carbon Tzibur. So therefore, all we need is the Tnufa of the Kohen. But in the case of Bikurim, the Tnufa has to be implemented by both the Yisrael and the Kohenim. So how do they do that together? I mean, that's a very profound sugya in itself. Because it could be that the Bailim will do the Tnufa from the bottom of the Kli, right? The Kli is the vessel that holds the Bikurim inside of it, and the Kohen will do the Tnufa from the top of the Kli. Other commentaries will hold that the Yadayim of the Bala Korban, Bala Bikurim, will be on the bottom and directly in contact with the Kli, and below his Yadayim, there'll be the Yadayim of the Kohen. And that, as I said before, is a very profound sugya, whether or not there's chatzitza between the Kli and the Yadayim. Anyway, getting back to Tnufa, it says in the Mishnah, Meniach shtei yodav lemata, molich umevi, maila umorid. So it seems that Tnufa, which is very reminiscent of what's it called, Nanuim in Lulav, you have to push it out, bring it back, and then go in all four directions. And we're going to see later on, maybe not today, that there are many philosophical ideas that are represented here by this, all the directions. Somehow it wards off, some evil forces in the world. Shenemar, Asher Hunaf, Vasher Huram. So the question is, what did the Mishnah see in that pasuk that teaches you that you need Tnufa in all these directions? He says that this pasuk appears in the parsha of the Miluim with regard to Aaron Ubanov, and the Tnufa in this pasuk indicates two motions, right? Because you say the pasuk says Asher Hunaf and Asher Huram. Now, the pasuk right before this says Ve'nafta osam Tnufa. So it seems that there's, on the one hand, you have the four different directions, but on the other hand, you have also Lamala Umorid Lamata. So again, this is all based on the various psukim in the parsha of Miluim. Mishnah says that Tnufa is of a Mizrach. Now, this is very interesting. Again, these are profound sugyas that would require days of work, because generally speaking, when we talk about the most important part of the Mizbeach, it's always going to be the Marav. And yet Tnufa here is in the Mizrach. So Rashi says that it means even in the Mizrach. But Kolshkein, it goes without saying that you could perform the Tnufa in the Marav of the Mizbeach. Hagosh, on the other hand, requires Marav. There's no Hagosha in the Mizrach, and that has to do with an equation in the Torah between mincha and chatos, because in the case of a korban chatos, you need what's called yisod. You need what's called shvichas shirayim. The leftover dam after the zrika has to be poured on the yisod of the mizbeach. There's no yisod on the mizbeach on the mizrach side. So we're going to equate hagasha with in a mincha with a korban chatos, and that's going to exclude mizrach. But Tnufa, on the other hand, is not, again, I'm afraid to say this, but Tnufa is not really an avoda. Like Hagasha is much more an integral part of the korban, and therefore it requires Keneged HaYisod, which means the Marav as opposed to the Mizrach. Okay, now there are certain cases in which you do both Tnufa and Hagasha. Which comes first? Tnufos, Kodmos, Lahagoshos. First we do the Tnufa, and then we do the Hagosha. Now, once again, we're getting into a very, very profound sugya. We're talking about the Minchas HaOmer and the Minchas Knos of a Sota. They require both Tnufa and Hagosha. Because the Pasuk says, "V'lakacha kohen miyad ha'ishas minchas haknos v'heinif es hamincha l'fnei Hashem v'hikrivosa." So you have both v'heinif es hamincha and v'hikrivosa. So you need both tnufa and hagosha. So that's with regard to the omer and the minchas knos. Now Rashi learns that tnufos kodos lagoshos means on these specific menachos that require both hagosha and tnufa. The tnufa comes first and the hagosha comes later. Tosas is going to learn a whole different pshat here. Tosas is going to learn that this Mishnah of Kodmos, of Kedima, belongs to a sugya in Zvachim that sets up a whole din of Kedima. Like, for example, let's say there's a korban olah that has to be brought, there's a korban shlomim that has to be brought, a korban chatos, and the Mishnayos in Zvachim will address which korban should the Kohen address first. Here too, we're talking about two different menachos. There's going to be one mincha that requires tnufa and not hagosha, another korban that requires hagosha and not tnufa, and which gets preference in the avodas hakohen. Which of the menachos should he do first? And the fact that the mincha needs tnufa gives it a kedima over above another mincha that requires hagosha. Now the Mishnah says, Minchas ha'om minchas knos, tu'unos hagosha u'tnufa. Right, as we said before, the psukim indicate that these require both tnufa and hagosha. Now it's interesting that the Mishnah mentions this after it's already said that tnufa's kodmos lagoshos. So that makes sense according to the other pshat that we gave, that we're talking about kedima in two different menachos. Because if, like Rashi's pshat is correct, that we're talking about what comes first in one particular mincha, then first the Mishnah should have told us which menachos require both tnufa and hagosha, and then tell me which comes first. Lechem aponim uminchas nesachim ein tunas lo hagosha velo tnufa. Again, now, in the case of lechem aponim, right, we had a discussion about whether hagosha only applies when there's a kmitza, and there's no kmitza in the lechem aponim, and minchas nesachim, likewise, is kulo kolil. It's completely burnt, so there's no kmitza to be mat to the shirayim. I mean, you can check me up on your tablets over there, make sure I'm not making any mistakes. So if I assume that hagosha is generated by kmitza, then we understand that these two karbanos don't require kmitza, and therefore they don't require hagosha. Another possibility is that the Minchas Nesachim is an accompaniment of the carbon ola, the carbon shlamim. It's not migufo. It's not really in and of itself an independent carbon. But that's all as far as Hagosh is concerned. As far as Tanufa is concerned, you're going to have to assume that for some reason, you can't just say that, well, in these two karbanos, the Torah doesn't mention Tanufa, because the Torah doesn't go through Tanufa for every single carbon. So we're going to have to figure out why the Sugi Sagamar, why Lechem Aponim and why Lechem Aponim and Minchas Nesachim don't require Tnufa. Rabbi Shimon Omer, this is again a challenging piece in the Mishnah. Shlosha minim te'unim sholosh mitzvos shtayim b'chol achas v'yachas. We're going to have three categories of menachos. Actually, we're not limited to menachos because we're going to have asham mitzora, which is not a korban mincha at all. But in any event, in these three types of karbanos, we're going to have, all told, amongst all three minim, all three categories of karbanos, we have three mitzvahs. But in each one, we only have two out of the three. Again, it's going to shift around. Let's see if we can figure this out. So again, in all these three categories, we're going to need two out of the three of the mitzvos. Zivchei Shalmei Yachid, Zivchei Shalmei Tziva. These go together as one group. And in these cases, we're going to require a double smicha, but no tnufa. And then we have Hasham Mitzora, and that's going to require smicha and one of the two tnufos. So let's go through it. Zivchei Shalmei Yachid, that requires two tnufos. A tnufa. No, I'm sorry. I jumped ahead of myself. I'm talking about Shalmei Tzibur. Now, let's go back again to Shalmei Yachid. Shalmei Yachid will only have one tnufa, and that's the tnufa after shchita of the murim and the chaz v'shok, but they have smicha. So Shalmei Yachid requires smicha, which itself needs work because smicha is usually for chet and shlom is not for chet. So that has to be understood. But in any event, there's no tnufa michaim. Ein b'hem tnufa michaim. So you don't jack up tnufa to two. There's only one tnufa. Plus you need smicha. That's two out of the three. And then we have zivchei shalmei tziva. They're going to have two tnufos, one michaim together with the kivsei atzeres, and another afterwards after shchita. And they don't require smicha because there's no smicha on a carbon tzibur. Carbon tzibur never requires smicha. So zivchei shalmei tzibur as a carbon tzibur don't require smicha, but they require two tnufos. That's very unique to shalmei tzibur, to the shnei kivsei atzeres. The asham mitzora. So asham mitzora has only tnufa, I think Michaim. Let's just think. All right, let's read the Mishnah. I'm trying to test myself if I remember. Ton smicha utnufa Michaim. Interesting. What's unique about the case of Asham Mitzora is that there's no tnufa after shchita like there is in Shlomim. Meaning, in both Shalmei Yachid and Shalmei Tzibur, there's smicha liachar shchita. No. 1 second. Did I get that right? Just 1 second. Sorry. Are we talking about smicha or tnufa? Let me get this straight. Oh yeah, let's talk about tnufa. I'm not sure if I mentioned this. That in the case of tnufa, with shlomim, we need tenufa after shechita, whether it's a shalmei yochid or a shalmei tzibur, they need tenufa liachar shechita. So what's the deal? Oh, there's no tenufa liachar shechita in the case of Hasham Mitzorah. Let's see if I'm right. Hasham Mitzorah, ta'un smicha utnufa chai. Okay, smicha is always michayim, but there's a tnufa michayim ve'embo tnufa shach. But after shechita, there's no tnufa. So that stands in contrast to the shalomim, where whether it's shalmi yochid or shalmi tzibur, there's going to be tnufa liachar shechita. The only difference between shalmi yochid and shalmi tzibur is whether there's tnufa michayim. So that shalmi tzibur require, in addition to the tnufa after shechita, a tnufa michayim, which is not the case in shalmi yochid. On the other hand, shalmi yochid requires smicha, whereas a shalm tzibur, like any korban tzibur, does not require smicha. In the case of Hasham Mitzorah, since it's a korban yochid for the Mitzorah, therefore he requires smicha. But as far as tenufa is concerned, everything goes upside down, inside out. Instead of a tenufa liachar shechita, is a tenufa michayim. And the Gemara is going to explain this not today, but on Shabbos. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa. And now we're quoting a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Yudalid. It says Ve'kriv oso liasham. So we're dealing with Parshas Mitzorah. Beslog hashamen vehenif osam tnufa. So it's very interesting. Here's the case of tnufa michayim. And the tnufa is done with the log hashemen. So we're talking about the korban asham. It says vehikriv osoli asham, and there's going to be vehenif osam in the plural, referring to the beginning of the pasuk, which is the asham, and the next part of the pasuk, which is log Hashem. Tnufa ke'echad, that you do a tnufa with both the korban and the log shemen, and that's going to be done michayim. If he messed up on this, and instead of doing one tnufa of both, he did two individual tnufos, one tnufa on the korban and another tnufa on the log shemen, is yotza. Talmud Lomar, and how do we know this? Vehikriv oso li osham vehenif. So I guess the word vehenif, which is in the singular, applies to both the asham and the log, that you could accept. It's not the ideal that you did a tnufa on the asham separately and on the log separately. So there's a sfas emes here that goes to town. The halacha is that tnufa is not ma'akif. Tnufa is not essential to the korban. So what is this brisa telling me? Yotza. What do you mean yotza? Even if you didn't do any tnufa at all, you were yotza. So you have to tell me yotza? Why do you have to tell me yotza? That's Vasemis Kash. I wonder if he quotes it. Let's see. No, I don't think he quotes it. Anyway. Yachal yonif v'yachzir v'yonif. So in a case where he went ahead and he did a separate tnufa on the log shemen and a separate tnufa on the chatos, do we require that he do it a second time around? Tamid loma tnufa below tnufos. He doesn't have to do it a second time around. So once again, this Vasemis goes to town over here. What do we lose by going through the tnufa a second time around? I'm trying to remember this Vasemis' answer, but right now it eludes me. Okay, let's go on. Now, we're back to the pasuk that we started with, and the pasuk says, Hashem. Now, what's lifnei Hashem? B'mizrach. That's interesting. Why is the mizrach of the mizbeach considered lifnei Hashem? So Rashi says again, as we mentioned earlier, afilu mizrach, that even the mizrach is considered lifnei Hashem, even though the Marov, which is right near the Heichal, is closer to Hashem. So the Gemara asks for Omar. We have a brisa. Now, I think this brisa we're about to learn is not talking about Tnufa, but rather about Hagosha. Yochel b'Mayrov. So you see that from the language of the brisa, Lifnei Hashem Yochel b'Mayrov, it means that the Mayrov is Lifnei Hashem. So why do you tell me that the Tnufa is on the Mizrach? Amri, the Gemara answers, Hani mili mincha. In the case of mincha, you must have Marav. And why is that? Because in the case of a mincha, de ikri chatos, we have an equation in the pasuk, right? He tells you where the pasuk is in Vayikra Vav Kodesh Kadoshim Hi Kachatos, and that's referring to the mincha. And in the case of a chatos to una yisod, right? There's a mitzvah of shvicha shiraim al yisod, and where is the yisod? The yisod is on the Mairav. And Keren Dromis Mizrachis Lohoy Yisod. Right? So you could not, in a Korban Chatas, you could not possibly fulfill the mitzvah of Shvicha Shirayim on the Mizrach, because there's no Yisod on the Keren Dromis Mizrachis. So again, I apologize here because it really, to go through this whole thing and figure out where the Yisod is and where there's no Yisod, you have to go through Mishnayos and Talmud. But we'll have to take my word for it that there's no Yisod on the Mizrachis, it's only on the Mairav. So that's as far as Menachos are concerned. But now we're not talking about a mincha, we're talking about the Karban Osham of a Mitzorah. That's not a mincha. It doesn't have an equation to chatos. Even the eastern side, again, that's where Rashi learns this Gemara, is appropriate for lifnei Hashem, and therefore the tenufa can be done lifnei Hashem on the eastern side of the Mizbeach. The Rambam seems to assume that it's got to be done on the eastern side, not like Rashi. Habikurim Kedivrei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, they require Tnufa. My Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, where do we find this in Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? The Sanya, we learned in the Brisa, and this is referring to the parsha of Kitovo in Sefer Dvarim, where the parsha of Bikurim is, and it says V'lakacha Kohen. Let's see if he quotes the whole pasuk here. Looking in the Torah or here, V'lakacha Kohen. V'lakacha Kohen hatena miyodecha ve'nicho lifnei mizbach Hashem Elokecha. Now, where does it say Tnufa in this pasuk? It says Hanocha ve'nicho lifnei mizbach Hashem. Limed al bikurim shetu'unim Tnufa divrei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. How does he see Tnufa here? My time with Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. What led Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov to the conclusion that bikurim required Tnufa? The pasuk only says in Velokach, it says ve'nicho lifnei mizbach Hashem Elokecha. And the answer is, he has Gzeir Shova, Gomar Yad Mishlomim. Ksiv Hoch in the parsha of Bikurim, it says, V'lakacha Kohen atena miyadecha. Uksiv Hosam. And the parsha of Shlomim, it says, with regard to Shlomim, it says Yodov to Vienna. So we're going to make this Gzeir Shova of Yad Yad. And just like in Shlomim, you require Tnufa, right? And in Shalma Yochid, right, the Tnufa is going to be Liachar Shchita. Is so too in the case of Bikurim, you require Tnufa. Okay, that's what we have here.